So I started off actually wanting to be a biomedical researcher. I wanted to be a genetics, go into pure genetics research. That was my interest. And at some point, I perhaps because of the peers I was with, I found everyone was going into medicine. And so that's how it was quite accidental, actually, that I took a medical entrance exam and ended up in a medical college. Otherwise, I was on the PhD track. But just that everyone in my BSc class was what was called pre-med in those days. So almost the whole class was going for their medical entrance. So anyway, so that's how I got into medicine, but that did not dim my passion for research. But then I found through medical school that the word research was hardly mentioned, that we had absolutely no training in research methods. This was the late 70s. And I went to one of the best medical schools. I went to the Armed Forces Medical College in Pune. But so we had excellent training and teaching and everything, but the word research was not there. The concept was not there. And then internship happened. I joined an MD at the All India Institute, again, arguably the best institution in India, and did a thesis, but it was, I would say, more of a farce of a research project. And so this is why I then went to the US, because I realized I needed some research training, which was not that I hadn't really, had that kind of rigorous training at all, biostatistics, nothing. So it's just what one picked up on one's own. Ethics, not much. So when I went to the US and I did a fellowship there, it was a clinical fellowship program, but with a very strong research built into it. And, I had a choice of mentors. I could have worked in the animal lab doing mouse experiments. I could have worked on the clinical side, but I opted to work in the respiratory physiology lab, where I was studying sleep physiology. And along with a colleague, another fellow who was from Scotland, we actually built instruments to measure ventilatory responses to carbon dioxide and to hypoxia, and then tested children with different kinds of respiratory problems on these devices to basically find out whether they had problems with their central control of breathing. And then I went on to do another year in a sleep lab in Leicester, in the UK, where I also explored the same thing, but I was doing it in twins to see how much of it was genetically controlled. So that was actually my research, and it was very productive. I must say that in these 3 years, I had several very good publications, and I had always wanted to return to India. And so the idea was that I would come back with already having done my clinical pediatric training, with this additional research expertise and training, and then be able to come and work in a medical college, for example, doing clinical. I wanted to do all three: clinical, care, teaching, and research. And I think that's a perfect and that's what people in the US do. And that's how the schools there are set up. But then reality actually struck hard when I came back, and I was told in no uncertain terms that I have to choose, that this was some sort of a pipe dream, that you could do everything. And you're either a clinician and you practice, or you work in a medical school and you teach, and of course do some outpatient and inpatient work. You treat patients, of course, in a medical college, and then forget about research, because very few medical schools will give you that option. I think you can count on one hand the medical schools which are doing high quality research, or you go into research and forget about the other two. So as it happened, I joined the ICMR Institute in Chennai, the Tuberculosis Research Center, because when I visited there, I found that I was quite excited by the opportunity and the infrastructure and the fact that everybody was thinking research, So that's how, but I always have that regret that I couldn't do the other. I saw patients as part of our research studies, but not really taking care of patients on a day-to-day basis. So The other challenge I faced was the fact that at that time, this was in the early 90s, when I came back to India and started working, there really wasn't a lot of support for international collaborations. There was, I must say, that at that time the ICMR had a scheme for returning Indians. So it was called Supernumerary Research Cadre, similar to what the Ramalinga Swamy program today, where they gave you a mid-career level appointment in one of the ICMR institutes for a period of about 3 years, and then you could start working and then potentially, I suppose, apply for jobs, for vacancies as they arose. So I was very lucky that at that time the Director General met me, the ICMR DG, Dr. Tripathi, and he immediately said, "You are an ideal candidate for this program." And there was no bureaucracy at all. I was immediately given an appointment order. But again, that, it just happened that as an individual, he took that immediate decision. But there are programs. So what I'm trying to say is there were less programs then. Now there are more programs for returning Indian scientists. There's the Welcome DBT Alliance, there's the Ramalinga Swamy, and then there's the one in DST. Which I'm blanking on now.
The Inspire Fellowship.
Or
Yes.
Ramanujan. The Ramanujan as well, right?
Ramanujan, yes. And there are more scientific institutions today, and there's much more, openness to having people come back. In fact, I think there is really a need. I just saw the DG ICMR appointment, which was made 2 days ago, is someone who's worked outside India for 20 years at the WHO. So, I think these are all very positive signs, that merit is recognized and that people are welcomed back because of the experience that they've had outside. So attitudes have changed. Having said that, it's still a challenge. There are still not enough positions and not enough attractive places to go back. And once you're back, you do face day-to-day, challenges. But I've realized, after having worked in many places, including at the WHO, that it's there everywhere. And sometimes we complain a lot about our system and our bureaucracy. And it is true that it can be very frustrating, but the same thing also happens in other large organizations all around the world. And so one has to be pragmatic and realistic, but at the same time, you have to be quite clear as to what you want to do and what your area is, what you want to focus on, and what relationships you want to build. It's important to build relationships in India with peers and with institutions, not just have, the international. So when I went back, I had my international connections and people continued to want to work with me. But at the same time, the first thing I did when I went back was to say, I need to find out which are the other institutions in Chennai that I should be aware of and that I should be working with in this area that, what I had chosen to work on. And so I went to because I hadn't spent time in Chennai when I was training, or in my younger days, I didn't know people, I didn't know. So I had to go and introduce myself and say, I'm so-and-so, I'm working here. This is my area of interest. I think you can be a very good partner. And I must say the reception was very positive. And I remember the chief of pediatric pulmonology. It was a growing new area, really. There weren't too many experts. Was very happy. And he said, for the first time, we have somebody from a research institute coming and saying, we want to work with the clinical group. And that partnership during my early years back in India was excellent for me and for them, I think, because I got the clinical exposure that I had always wanted, and they got the lab, the kind of experiments and assays I could run for them that they could never have run in the children's hospital. It didn't exist. So that was one. The second was building multidisciplinary. I realized very early on that, at least in my case, that my research would not be successful if the team was not multidisciplinary. And so, again, that was something different, unusual at that time. It wasn't part of the way in which the team in that institute was used to working. The doctors were actually at the top of the hierarchy, and then came the lab people, and then came the nurses and the social workers and the community health workers and so on. But the way that I approached it was more of a team where everyone has a role to play, and that we can only be successful if we all play our role. And if the lab is not up to the mark, if the lab is not an accredited lab, if the assays cannot be believed, and if the head of the lab is not a well-recognized person in the field, then the institute is not going to be recognized as such. So I think one very good thing for me working in an ICMR institute was the fact that we had all of these, and it only required a little bit of motivation, training, and opportunities, which at that time, like I took opportunity of the Fogarty program, for example, to send many staff abroad for 3 months, 6 months training, statisticians, social scientists, lab scientists. And I myself had that exposure where, as a clinician who knew a little bit about, laboratory medicine, was actually thrown into the lab and told to do my own experiments by my mentors. And I must say, I must thank them. At that time, it seemed a bit cruel that I must do everything myself. But looking back, I think it was excellent that I had to do my own flow cytometry. I had to set up my own cell culture experiments. I had to harvest the supernatants. I had to run the ELISAs. I also had to, set up the HIV lab. So I had to know what, viral load equipment was, what a sequencer was, etc., etc. So even though I don't claim to be an expert on everything, that push, which my mentors said that is very important for you as if you want to be a serious researcher, to know about that. Plus going into the field and really seeing the reality in the field. How does epidemiology work? How do field studies get conducted? Because if you don't know how studies are done in the field, then you can easily be taken for a ride by your field teams, because you can basically, data can be just gathered sitting in one place, and you will never know unless you know how to look at that data and interpret it and be able to point out or figure out that something seems to be missing and so on. So getting on top of all of these different elements, particularly if you work in a field where there are these different disciplines, building the partnerships, building the relationships with institutions in your own city, state, and outside, but also maintaining the relationships you make when you're out abroad, obviously training, very, very important and critical. Those collaborations, those friendships also can hold you in very good stead later. For my own research, of course, it was important that it have some impact on policy, because I was into what you may call translational or applied research. It's not pure science. And so the engagement with policymakers was a whole different, also cup of tea, a very different kind of experience, which you have to learn only by doing. When you start interacting with policymakers, you realize they have a very different outlook. They have different questions, different priorities. They don't see things the way researchers see them. And so if you want to have your research translated into policy, then there is also a different path there that needs to be, and you have to build it and nurture it. It doesn't happen overnight. All of these things are basically about building trusted relationships. And that, takes time, and it takes investment of time, and it takes, of course, integrity and honesty and all of that. And championing, serving as a mentor, as a friend also to your other peers, and particularly the juniors. As a woman, I'm often asked, like, did you face, barriers and discrimination, etc.? I won't say that I faced. In fact, the worst boss I had was a woman. So I won't say that I was discriminated because I was a woman. I think it really depends on the person, how they are as boss. And my best mentor was a man, my director, who actually mentored me and helped me to grow and to really develop confidence, etc., and represent at national meetings and at international meetings. So, but it's true that as a young woman scientist, when I entered a room, it would be mainly men, older, senior men, mainly from North India. And as somebody going from the South, as somebody going as a woman and as a younger person, you have those disadvantages in that people don't automatically take you seriously. And the conversation is often very dominated by a few dominating people in the room. And you have to, again, make an effort to make your point to be heard. If you are very aggressive, you're labeled as aggressive. And if you're not, then you can be easily forgotten. And no one might even remember to ask you for your opinion. So for a woman, it is also a balance there to be treated seriously, taken seriously. Again, all of these things are changing, I think, but very slowly, because if you look at the leadership of our institutions, it's mostly male. And again, it's not unique to India at all. All over the world, the leadership of institutions is still dominated by men, including in global health, and men from high-income countries. Okay, so that's a double, of course, if you're from a developing country, and if you're a woman, you haven't been at one of the top universities in the world, abroad, that is outside India, those are all disadvantages that all of us would see in common. But then again, it's through your own work. Your work has to speak. Ultimately, there's nothing else. There are no shortcuts. So my passion was always on my work, on the research, on the next question, to be answered, and how to set up, high quality research studies. So once, if you do that, then automatically your work speaks for you, and you will be taken seriously. And this is what my mentor always used to say, that, you are the expert in this field. So if they want someone to come and tell them about HIV and TB, who else are they going to invite? And I used to say, I'm too junior, they won't take me seriously. And they said, but you're the one who's actually doing the work. So you go first time, second time, they don't take you seriously, but then they will sooner or later. Yeah, and then of course, when I became a senior and was into a role where I could determine policy, my main priority was really how to support research in our medical schools, how to build interest, how to, introduce training, how to mentor young medical people who might want to make a career in research, or at least do research, even if they're not full-time into it. And that's the Department of Health Research was basically set up, in order to do that. I think it's achieved some of its initiatives, but also having these large national programs, mission kind of programs, which were focused on particular areas like tuberculosis. How do you solve a problem of TB? You have to bring basic scientists, immunologists, bacteriologists, the clinicians, epidemiologists, and patients themselves together to solve it. So I had set up the India TB consortium, research consortium, basically to address that. Similarly, there are national missions which have been set up by DBT and others. And I worked very closely with Secretary DBT when I was head of the ICMR on many things, including on vaccination policy. So I don't know if this is helpful at all. I know that you're all, at a stage where you are looking for opportunities. You are, perhaps some of you want to go back, some of you don't want to go back. But I can stop there and maybe open it up for discussion and some Q&A. Who's asking? So is that you,
I think
Rohit?
Rohit should be the
Rohit?
moderator, and Pratik as well, because those
Yes.
two were
Yes.
responsible. Yeah. Go ahead.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan. That was really helpful for me personally as well as a PhD student, and I'm sure it will be for others as well. We have just a few minutes to take some questions, and we already have lots of questions in the chat box. So first, I'll start with one question that was posed by Richa, and that is also similar to what we are going to have in the next immediately after this talk. We are going to have a session where we have invited talks from early career researchers who will talk about how they are planning to tailor their research when they're going back to India. And we have some mentors who are currently working in India in different research fields who will give them some advice. And so Richa's question is about healthcare and medicine. which is that what are some key areas that young researchers in India should focus on in terms of medicine and healthcare, and where you feel India is lacking. And I would also pose it as a general question for people who are trying to go back to India, how they should tailor their research from what they're doing outside India to when they go back to India, which would be helpful.
I mean, that's a great question. And of course, the field is very wide. So it's impossible to say that, you should do this or that. But it also depends on what your training is. And, if you're doing very basic science, then I think it's good to continue with that, because you need the basic science. You don't get solutions out of nothing if you're not investing in basic science. So, and there are very many good institutions in India where you can do that. I would, on the health and the medical side, obviously, I mean, I think we have huge problems, public health problems for which we need solutions. Some of them are perhaps, in terms of products, particularly I would say in the area of diagnostics, in the area of point of care diagnostics, self-tests, which we've seen with COVID, but earlier with things like HIV testing, pregnancy testing, there are many things where you can do self-tests. But self and point of care testing is going to be, for the future, very, very important, so that right now people get treated without really knowing what they have, and very often it's never detected or never diagnosed, rather. It's always a syndromic kind of a management. And that's partly because we don't have affordable diagnostics in the field. Similarly, one could think about a disease like cancer, which is going to increase the burden of cancer is going to increase in all developing countries. Certainly in India, it's already increasing. Again, a lot of it is detected very late. There isn't a lot of screening done, including on genetic screening, and the treatment is difficult. It's quite often unaffordable. So this, for me, I feel, the leap forward with the mRNA technology, more than vaccines, I feel that in the field of biologics, in the field of particularly cancer therapeutics, there are huge opportunities and applications. And, it's all linked with advances in genomics. We should be using those technologies. So again, I guess for me, the message is, okay, we've got so many advances in technologies, whether these are digital technologies, AI and so on, or whether they are in the lab in terms of gene editing, in terms of mRNA. How do we use those to solve our problems, but do it in a way where it's affordable? So R&D for affordable access is something that India can show the world how to do. We're very good at making generic medicines, right? But there's not a lot of R&D that's being done. And I hope that companies in India will also now invest more. They've seen what they can do with, India had the first DNA vaccine for COVID, even though it's not very widely used. The fact is that a company did invest and create a DNA product, which had not been done before. We have an mRNA vaccine developed in India. So we have a lot of potential for increasing an R&D into the kind of health products that we need. We haven't come up with a TB vaccine. We haven't come up with a new TB drug, which India has the highest burden of TB in the world. We don't even have a good test to look for progression. Now, all of this actually needs collaborative exercises. And this is one of the reasons why I set up the India TB Research Consortium, was to say agencies have to come together. So DBT and ICMR and DST should be working together, because no one group can solve this problem alone. You need the samples, you need the patients, you need the technology, you need the genomics, you need the immunology to be able to look at things like biomarkers. So, and then we have all the non-communicable disease. I mentioned cancer as one of them. And then the links now between climate change and health, where we need both mitigation, but also adaptation strategies and new ways of doing things. So there's a whole breadth, actually, if you look at India, because, it's a subcontinent, anything you put your hand on will be a problem in India. But of course, some are bigger public health problems. Anemia is, I would say, the biggest challenge we haven't been able to solve now for decades. After decades and decades of an anemia control program, we don't understand why our rates of anemia in women and children keep going up, despite all the interventions that the government has made, and malnutrition. So there's a very vast canvas. There's the basic understanding of disease. One can work on that area, but there's then also the translational applications, and then of course the field, and the final, the clinical trials and the testing and all of that. And again, that is another area where India can do much more in terms of really expanding the clinical trials ecosystem.
Thank you, Dr. Swaminathan. We are almost running out of time, so probably we'll have time for just one more question. So Asim, do you want to ask any last question?
I see a lot of very interesting questions. The question, if I am given the privilege of age, is how can we enable these kids to function effectively in India? We encourage them to go to India, find careers. And often I find that once they get there, there is, of course, a long lag phase before they become productive. How can we reduce that? And associated question, would it be possible, because many of the people here are doing cutting edge research in laboratories, leading laboratories in the world, right? So I see Kalki sitting at Harvard, for instance. Would it be possible for someone like that to have a footprint both here and there? Because I found that when we tried to get joint appointments or joint labs or programs that would permit that sort of fluidity, there were numerous unnecessary barriers.
So this is something which should be taken up again, I think, at the highest policy level. My own feeling is that we need to rethink some of the rules that were created for these institutions and organizations. They were all set up 40, 50, 60 years ago after independence, and then rules were made in the 70s and 80s. We live in a different era today, and I don't think we've moved along and changed and adapted. And so I think the scientific leadership in India, the current leadership and perhaps just the immediate past leadership, could get together and think through some very concrete, and maybe this group can propose things like this, joint appointments. I agree that it would incentivize people to do that and build those bridges. There's also, of course, a lot of rules now around data and how data can be used and not used, etc. So, many of those things also become a little bit limiting. But the main thing the Indian government, I suppose, is interested in is protecting, the interests of and not letting, which everyone agrees that, the work done in India should be credited, recognized, etc. But I think there are enough ways of doing that today without putting unnecessary bureaucratic hurdles. But you raise a very good point, and I don't have the solution, but we can certainly open that debate, and I hope that we can find better ways and expand the kind of programs that you set up.
What has become apparent to me from watching the way some of these institutions do it, and in particular, I'm going to Israel next month to the Weizmann Institute, and I'm sitting at Stanford, and the person with whom I'm going has an appointment here and a lab here, and has an appointment there and a lab there, right? And if those kinds of models could be examined and Indianized, if you will, right? Nothing is directly made for order. I mean, I think we could really benefit people, because sometimes the hesitation, someone like me or people along the path, right, who establish themselves here and have a productive career, there's a great barrier to going back. Right? Even though there is interest to, it's a great barrier to leave behind. Or what I see currently is my colleagues who are engaged with India are engaged at a level that does not, have the impact it could have. Right? And some of the same people we are talking about who are sitting at NCBS or at Ashoka or other places, being able to engage more effectively will only be possible if, like you said, senior leadership, which I believe includes you. So the onus is on you, I suppose. We could put together this really capable team sitting here. Could put together some thoughts on this, and then we could sharpen them with your advice if you're up for it.
Sure. No, very happy to, because I really believe in strengthening, the scientific enterprise in India, and anything we can do. As I said, there have been many initiatives, but I think some fundamental things like the example you just gave need to change, and I'll be happy to do my bit.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Aseem, and thank you, Dr. Swaminathan. And we have lots of questions in the chat. I'm sure I also have a lot of questions for you, but unfortunately we have run out of time for today. But we would like to connect with you again for sure, and we'd like to ask all these questions. And thank you so much for joining today. It was a great pleasure and honor to host you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.